Okay, welcome back. This is the second video in the lecture series for today. This is week 5, day 1, and we're talking about safety. And in this video, we're going to talk about the types of errors that people make and how we need to design a safe environment in your UI to be able to prevent those errors and how to help recover from those errors when they do happen. And that's a really critical issue, that safety in terms of UI design is meant as in protection from errors. That's what we're trying to be safe from. When mistakes happen, can we recover? And are we safe from even producing those errors in the first place? So this is one of the big misconceptions in this class. So I want to take a minute just to hammer this idea home, because even though I usually at least highlight it, I still have folks who default back to a more common understanding of safety. In UI work, we use the word safety slightly differently than you might expect, okay? Safety does not mean security. There's two different concepts there at work, and we often, in colloquial terms, conflate the two ideas. Safety, in terms of UI, is reducing errors in use. You're trying to make it safe from errors. And safety is also providing effective recovery methods when errors do occur. To really illustrate what that looks like, I have an example for you. That's often the thing that people jump to when they're sort of misapplying the idea of safety here. Credit card information. When you input credit card information into a website, you might think, is this encrypted? Is this something that people who might misuse this information have access to? What sort of things are we doing to kind of make sure that this transaction happens without any problems from, people stealing my credit card number, right? When that's the case, we're talking about security. And so things like the type of SSL security certificates associated, or Norton has a whole suite to handle these things to make people feel comfortable. That's security that makes the transaction secure. And that's important, but it's not a focus of our course. We're not thinking about that in terms of usability. In our course, we are concerned about safety. Safety is about the errors that can happen. So in this same example, one common thing that we see in credit card input aspects of the UI is that you get some visual feedback when the input doesn't match the expected input style. So for a credit card number, there's always 4 sets of 4 digits. And if it doesn't match that, then you often will see some sort of error like this. This one's a little overdone. Usually it's just a little red around the box is sufficient. Okay. Same thing for these other codes here. If they don't match the input style or the limitations on the input, then you'll get a little bit of an error message on there. And we're going to talk about some details of those things. But I really want to hammer this idea home. There's a big difference between safety and security. And when you're talking about safety in this class, you've got to mean about errors, not about secure transaction type things. Cool. So things we're going to learn today. We're going to talk about helpful error messages. We're going to talk about different kinds of human error. And we're going to talk about how we prevent user errors when we're designing a UI. Okay. I particularly think that the helpful ways of writing error messages is one of my favorite topics, but I don't know if we're going to get too far into it. But let's start at the beginning, because errors in UI interaction often happen because of the way that humans process information. And so I want to be able to think about what we consider as 3 separate parts of the information processing system that we can imagine where errors might happen. So the first part of information processing for people is actual just perception. And we can have errors there. You might not see something properly, you might not hear something properly, you might not, taste something properly. But those perceptions, we can have errors in there. And particularly what happens with these types of errors, it actually has to do with biases that we have, right? What our body was looking for at the time will really impact what we perceive. For example, our vision is actually designed to filter a lot of the information that we have come in so that we don't actually have to process everything. So there's a lot of pre-processing that happens in our perception, and that can actually cause errors in what we perceive. Right? If you ever looked at a website to try to find where you're supposed to click and never even see it, it's most likely because your brain is pre-processing your perception to not notice that thing if you literally don't see it. So once information gets past perception, then there's a cognitive phase here where you actually now sort of process these things, okay? And errors can happen there as well. So particularly for recall and memory type of things, where if you perceive a red light and there is just an error in the way that you process it and it doesn't spark to mind that you're supposed to stop right away, that's a cognitive error that happens in the process. Now, red lights were pretty hardwired for, so it's not often that that happens. But for a novice driver of a car who doesn't have this really long standing thing, or many of you, some of you might not actually even know how to drive a car, that cognitive process isn't really well set, so errors can happen there. And finally, the process ends with an actual action, right? And again, that's where we can have errors that happen as well. Usually the action one is the one that's most visible to us and we hold people most accountable for, but we can have errors that happen across all three of these things. Because of that, we can also sort of classify cognitive behavior here and think about their roles in error production. So I like to, there's typically three here, but I really like to break these down into just two different categories. There are skill-based behaviors that are these sort of rotely memorized and muscle memory type of procedures. So when you're writing out your own name, you don't really have to think much about it, but you can still make an error. But this is a skill-based thing, writing your name or walking or chewing gum, things that you don't really have to think about, that are just sort of memorized. The other type of behavior we might think about is called a knowledge-based one. And this is where you're sort of applying things here. So you're doing problem solving, logical evaluations, experimentation, and these are kind of judgment things where, again, errors can happen, but it's not that you didn't have it memorized properly. It's that you just sort of made a poor judgment or made a poor application of a rule. So we'll use those to also sort of classify the errors that could develop based on the type of cognitive behavior that's happening here. Okay, and so particularly for skilled behavior, I want to give you a quick example here to illustrate the difference. So of these three activities, which one of them is a skilled behavior? The double mouse click is something that we probably don't really have to think about. That was just sort of a rote action that we do, that we double click on things, where other things are much more advanced and complex. So skill-based things are typically fairly simple when we look at them. So let's look at types of human errors. We'll categorize these into three different categories. The first one we call a slip, the second we call a lapse, and the third we call a mistake. And we can group those visually in the way that they're related to each other. So mistakes are much more like planning errors, and they kind of have their own sort of separate category and really aren't related to the other two as much. Slips and lapses both fall into what we call an execution error. And so we'll dive into the differences between the three of those. But we can categorize most errors in a UI as being one of those three types. Again, slip is an execution type of an error. So these are errors and actions that you're already proficient in. So if you misspell your name or you bite your tongue while chewing, those are errors in execution and would be considered slips or lapses. Where a slip is going to be a failure to correctly execute some well-known procedure. You already know how to do it. You should be able to do it. This is one of my favorite examples in the class where I bring in a metaphorical example of a slip. So running, jumping in the air, and slamming a basketball into a hoop might be something that is a skill that you just have. You can do it without thinking about it. But you might slip and make a mistake even in doing that skill. And in this example, you might actually literally slip. Like this guy. Is it funny? It's funny in real life. I never know if these jokes actually carry at all online. So hopefully you're laughing. I don't know. If not, tell me you did. That's fine. But a slip is when you try to do something that you just normally do without thinking about it and you mess it up. A lapse, on the other hand, is a failure of memory. For example, you might forget the overall goal or forget where you are in a procedure and make a mistake. Often these are types of things where you sort of know what to do, but that you don't recall how or what to do properly, or again, you might get interrupted in the process of doing something. So these lapses are a failure of memory. So slips are almost usually more physical. Lapses are usually more mental. Okay? So then let's talk about mistakes. Mistakes are often thought about in terms of planning or application, and these are all those knowledge-based behavior errors. So with a mistake, this is where we're, like I said, making errors in planning or rule application, and this is typically happening to people who aren't expert in it, because oftentimes when you become an expert in some sort of thing, it actually goes more towards the skill, that you do these things without thinking, right? So for a basketball player, a slam dunk is probably more on the skill side, so it would be a slip. But if you've never played basketball before, right, and I just explained how to do this, you might do it out of order. You might jump off the wrong foot. You might, I don't know, drop the ball when you weren't supposed to. These are all planning or rule application mistakes, and they're all, like I said, often done by people who aren't expert in it, for novices. You might think of this in terms of a poor job of following directions, where you get lost driving to a new location, or not applying a rule correctly. And this is one of the cases that's especially intriguing because you actually probably thought you were doing it right, but you just applied a rule in the wrong time. Okay, so this is how we're going to categorize the three major ways that mistakes happen for human errors. And we're going to talk about those in terms of UIs in a little bit. But for an in-class assignment for today, what I'd like you to do is just think about times that you've done these things. They don't have to be in a digital or technological sort of world. They can be any types of these that you can think of. But write out a short example, a couple sentences each, of a time that you've made a slip, a time that you've made a lapse, and a time that you've made a mistake. And we'll have you turn these in for in-class examples. We won't share them with anybody, so feel free to be open and honest about these mistakes. But for each one, I do want you to think about why you made that mistake and then what would have prevented it. And these are really the critical things we're going to think about in UI design on how can we help people not make the mistake in the first place? How can we prevent it? And then the other thing is we're going to think about once they do make the mistake, how we're going to help them recover from it. So thank you for doing this in-class assignment. I really look forward to seeing your answers on this one. And we will pick up the next video in the lecture. Lecture is going to dive a little bit deeper into slip types because there's a few different ways to categorize those. We'll talk about that then, and I'll see you in a little bit. Thanks.